In the winter of 1891, a probate attorney named Samuel Greer was reviewing the estate of a recently deceased plantation family in Vicksburg, Mississippi, when he encountered a problem he had never seen in 30 years of legal practice. Someone had already reviewed it before him, not recently. The annotations in the margins of the estate documents were old, written in a hand that had faded with time, but remained perfectly legible. Whoever had made them had worked through the documents with systematic precision, noting every legal inconsistency, every procedural irregularity, every clause that contradicted established Mississippi property law. The annotations were not the work of a layman guessing at legal concepts. They were the work of someone who understood the law with a depth that Greer, a formally trained attorney, found genuinely impressive. The documents were from the Harwell estate. The annotations had been there for years, possibly decades, unnoticed because no one had looked at the originals since they were filed. Greer spent 2 days going through them before he felt certain enough to say what he was thinking out loud to his assistant. Someone used these documents to dismantle this family from the inside, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The Harwell family had been one of the most powerful dynasties in Warren County, Mississippi, for 3 generations. Augustus Harwell I had arrived in the Vicksburg area in 1821 with $200, a land grant, and a particular combination of ruthlessness and patience that transformed men into plantation owners in the antebellum South. By 1835, he owned 1,200 acres of some of the most productive cotton land in the state, 61 enslaved people, and a reputation for legal and financial cunning that made him one of the most feared men in Warren County. His son, Augustus Harwell II, inherited both the plantation and the reputation in 1849 and spent the following 2 decades expanding both. By 1860, the Harwell Plantation covered nearly 3,000 acres. The enslaved workforce had grown to over 100 people. The family's influence extended into the county courthouse, the state legislature, and the financial institutions of Vicksburg through a network of relationships that Augustus II had cultivated with the same methodical attention his father had applied to the land. The dynasty collapsed between 1872 and 1887, not from the Civil War, which had damaged but not destroyed it, not from emancipation, which had forced restructuring but not ruin. It collapsed through a series of legal challenges so precise and so well-timed that Samuel Greer, working backward from the wreckage in 1891, could only conclude that someone had been planning them for a very long time. That someone was a man named Elias. Elias had arrived at the Harwell Plantation in 1849 as part of the state transfer when Augustus I died and his son inherited. He was 27 years old, listed in the transfer documents as a house servant with no special skills noted. This was the first of many things the official record got wrong about Elias. He had been on the original Harwell property since childhood, had watched Augustus I build his dynasty from the ground up, and had developed, over 2 decades of proximity to power, an understanding of how that power actually worked that no official document would ever record. He had also, beginning sometime around 1849, started studying law. Not formally. There was no formal avenue available to him. What he had was access to the Harwell Library, which Augustus I had stocked with legal texts as practical tools for a man who spent considerable time in litigation over land and contracts. What he had was the ability to read, acquired in circumstances the records do not specify, but that several later accounts suggest involved the children of his previous owner teaching him alongside their own lessons. What he had was 22 years of nights, of stolen hours, of careful and patient accumulation of knowledge, in the only place it could be kept without being discovered, his own memory. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. Because what Elias did with 22 years of secret legal education, and how Samuel Greer pieced it together from the ruins of the Harwell dynasty in 1891, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of American law. And we are only at the beginning. The Harwell Library contained 43 legal texts when Elias first cataloged them in his memory in 1849. He knew their locations on the shelves, their binding colors, their approximate page counts. Within weeks of his arrival, he could not take them to his quarters. He could not be seen reading them during the day. What he could do was read during the hours when the library was in use, which in a household the size of the Harwell Plantation was more time than most people would have assumed. Early mornings before the family woke. Late evenings after the last lamps in the main house were extinguished. The occasional afternoon when Augustus II was away in Vicksburg and the household settled into the slower rhythm of his absence. He read everything. Mississippi property law, contract law, inheritance law, the specific statutes governing land transfers and estate proceedings in Warren County, the published decisions of the Mississippi Supreme Court that Augustus I had collected because they directly affected his business interests. He read them in the order they appeared on the shelves, and then he read them again in a different order, and then he began cross-referencing them in his mind, building a structure of legal knowledge that existed nowhere except in his own head because it could exist nowhere else. The first thing he understood, within a year of serious study, was that the Harwell Dynasty was built on a foundation that had more cracks in it than anyone looking at it from the outside would ever suspect. Augustus I had been a cunning man, but he had been a self-taught legal practitioner working in a period when land records in Mississippi were inconsistently maintained and courts were accessible primarily to men with the social standing to intimidate opposing parties out of litigation. Several of the land acquisitions he had made in the 1820s and 1830s had procedural irregularities that would not survive careful scrutiny in a properly conducted legal proceeding. The transfers had been recorded, but recorded incorrectly, with errors in property descriptions, in the chain of title documentation, in the witness attestations required by Mississippi law. These errors had never mattered because no one with the knowledge to identify them and the standing to challenge them had ever looked at the documents closely. Elias looked at them closely. He could not look at the original documents directly, but he had 20 years of access to the legal text that defined what those documents should contain, and he had 17 years of listening to Augustus II discuss his legal affairs with his attorney, a man named Collins who visited the plantation monthly, and who conducted those discussions with casual openness of man who had never once considered that the servant moving quietly through the room was following every word. By 1866, 1 year after emancipation, Elias had a complete picture of the Harwell Dynasty's legal vulnerabilities. He also had, for the first time in his life, the theoretical ability to act on that knowledge. He was a free man. The courts were, in principle, open to him. The Reconstruction era had produced legal changes that made it at least possible for a black man in Mississippi to initiate civil proceedings. Possible, not easy, not safe, not likely to succeed without resources he did not have and representation he could not afford. Elias spent the next 6 years building both. The details of how he did this are recorded in a document that surfaces only in 1923, when a researcher named Dr. Ada Morton at Fisk University was compiling oral histories of formerly enslaved people in Mississippi and found, in a church archive in Vicksburg, a memoir that Elias had dictated to a minister named Reverend Thomas Webb sometime in the late 1890s. The memoir, 47 handwritten pages, is the most complete account of what Elias did and how he did it. He worked. He saved. He cultivated relationships with the small community of black professionals that Reconstruction had briefly made possible in Vicksburg, men who had education and contacts and who were, like Elias, operating in a system designed to exclude them with tools that system had not anticipated them possessing. He found an attorney, a white Republican named James Olcott, who had come south during Reconstruction with genuine convictions about the law and who, when Elias sat across from him in 1868, and began explaining what he knew about the Harwell estate documents, listened with increasing attention, and then increasing astonishment. "You have been preparing this for how long?" Olcott asked when Elias finished. Since 1849, Elias said. Olcott was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Show me everything." The first legal challenge was filed in Warren County Circuit Court in February of 1872. It concerned a land parcel of approximately 200 acres in the southern portion of the Harwell holdings, acquired by Augustus I in 1831 through a transfer document that Elias had identified as containing a fatal error in the chain of title. The previous owner's estate had not been properly closed under Mississippi probate law before the transfer occurred, which meant, under the statutes that Elias had spent years memorizing, that the transfer itself was legally void. Augustus II's attorney, a man named Cornelius Bright, who had handled the Harwell family's legal affairs for 15 years, looked at the filing and dismissed it, a procedural technicality from 40 years ago. The land had been in continuous Harwell possession for 4 decades. The courts would not disturb settled property rights over a clerical error from 1831. He was wrong. Olcott had prepared for exactly this response and had assembled a case that addressed every counterargument with the precision of someone who had been thinking about the specific situation for years. Because he had not been thinking about it for years. Elias had. The court ruled in Elias's favor in November of 1872. The 200 acres were transferred to Elias's ownership. The reaction from Augustus II was immediate and violent in its fury. He threatened. He appealed. He used every instrument of social and financial pressure available to a man of his standing in Warren County. Olcott received threats that caused him to take his family temporarily out of Vicksburg. Elias received threats that he recorded in his memoir. With the same calm detachment he brought to everything else. They believe this is the end of the matter, he wrote. It is the beginning. The second challenge was filed in 1874. Another parcel. Another procedural irregularity from the original acquisition period. This one was more complex, involving a disputed witness attestation on a transfer document from 1828 whose signatory had died in 1833, leaving no estate records that could confirm his identity. Olcott argued the case for 8 months. The court ruled for Elias in September of 1875, 340 acres. The pattern was becoming visible to everyone in Warren County's legal community. Someone was systematically working through the Harwell estate's historical documentation, identifying the weakest points in the chain of title, and filing precisely targeted challenges that exploited those weaknesses one by one. Cornelius Bright brought in additional attorneys from Jackson to assist with the defense. They spent 6 months reviewing the Harwell estate documents, looking for vulnerabilities they could address proactively. They found many, too many to address before Elias found them first. The third challenge, filed in 1877, was the one that broke the family's capacity to resist. It concerned not a land parcel, but a foundational document of the entire estate, the original land grant that Augustus I had received in 1821, and upon which all subsequent acquisitions had been built. Elias had identified a discrepancy between the grant's recorded boundaries and the actual survey marks that had been placed in 1821, a discrepancy that under Mississippi property law created a cloud on the title of every parcel acquired using the original grant as the foundation of the chain. If this challenge succeeded, the legal uncertainty would extend not to a few hundred acres, but to the entire 3,000-acre estate. Augustus II died in March of 1878, before the court issued its ruling. His death was attributed to heart failure. He was 61 years old. His son, Augustus III, inherited the case along with his estate, and the growing understanding that the dynasty his grandfather had built was coming apart document by document in the hands of a man who had spent 22 years in a library he was not supposed to be in. The court ruled in Elias's favor in October of 1878. The cloud on title was confirmed. The estate entered a period of legal uncertainty from which it never recovered. The Harwell dynasty's final collapse between 1879 and 1887 was not a single event, but a process. The way a building whose foundation has been compromised does not fall all at once, but settles and cracks and becomes uninhabitable by degrees. Augustus III spent 8 years and most of the family's remaining financial resources attempting to resolve the title uncertainty that Elias's third challenge had created. He settled some portions of the estate by selling them at prices far below market value to buyers who were willing to accept the legal risk. He lost other portions to creditors who called in debts when the uncertainty made the land unusable as collateral. He fought some challenges in court and won some of them, but each fight cost money and time that the family could not recover. By 1887, the Harwell Plantation that had covered nearly 3,000 acres in 1860 had been reduced to a few hundred acres of marginal land worth a fraction of what the dynasty had been worth at its peak. Augustus III sold the remainder that year and moved his family to Memphis, where they had relatives and where the Harwell name carried less history. Elias, by 1887, owned just over 400 acres of what had been the Harwell estate, acquired through the legal proceedings and through subsequent purchases made with the proceeds of farming the land he had already won. He was 65 years old. He had spent 38 years on Harwell land, 22 of them in secret preparation, and 16 of them in open legal combat. He had outlasted 3 generations of the family that had owned him. He farmed the land for another decade. He did not engage in further litigation. He did not seek public attention. When Reverend Thomas Webb approached him in the late 1890s about the oral history project that would eventually produce the 47-page memoir, Elias agreed to participate with one condition. The memoir was not to be published or distributed during his lifetime. He wanted it placed in the church archive and left there until he was gone. Webb asked him why. Elias's response, recorded verbatim in Webb's notes, was characteristically precise. Because I have no interest in being a symbol while I am still alive. I have been a person my entire life. That is enough. He died in 1903 at the age of 81, on land that had once belonged to Augustus Harwell I. He is buried there. The grave marker gives his name, his birth year, and his death year. Nothing else. Dr. Ada Morton found the memoir in the Vicksburg Church Archive in 1923 and spent 2 years verifying its content against the Warren County legal records, the Harwell State documents, and the surviving papers of James Olcott, who had died in 1901, but whose files had been preserved by his family. Everything Elias had described in the memoir checked out. Every legal challenge, every ruling, every procedural argument was documented in the court records exactly as he had described it. What Morton could not fully document, and what she wrote about with considerable care in a monograph she published in 1925, was the 22 years of secret study. The library at the Harwell Plantation no longer existed. The legal texts Elias had used were gone. There was no physical evidence of the preparation, only its results, visible in the precision of the legal arguments that Olcott had filed beginning in 1872, and that bore, in Morton's assessment, the unmistakable marks of someone who had been building toward them for a very long time. She wrote, "We have no record of how Elias learned what he knew. We have only what he did with it. But what he did with it suggests a quality of preparation so sustained and so disciplined that it represents one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements I have encountered in 30 years of historical research." The monograph was cited occasionally in academic discussions of Reconstruction-era property law, and then largely forgotten as document about black achievement in the postbellum South. So often were, until a law professor at the University of Mississippi named Dr. Carroll Sims came across a citation in 1987 while researching a paper on property rights and historical injustice. Sims spent a sabbatical year working through the complete record. She published her account in 1989, and it reached a wider audience than Morton's 1925 monograph had. For the first time, the story of Elias and the Harwell Dynasty received serious attention outside academic circles. Legal historians began writing about it. Property law professors began using the case in their teaching. The Warren County Circuit Court records from 1872 to 1887, which had sat undisturbed in the county archive for over a century, were digitized and made publicly accessible. What those records show, read in sequence, is something that courtrooms are not often used to show: the gradual, methodical, legally precise dismantling of a structure of power and theft by the person that structure had been designed to exploit. File motion by file motion, ruling by ruling, parcel by parcel, over 15 years of open litigation that was itself only the visible portion of a process that had begun 22 years before the first filing. Samuel Greer had been right in 1891 when he looked at the annotated Harwell documents and said that someone had used them to dismantle a dynasty from the inside. He just had not understood yet how far inside, or how long ago it had begun. Vicksburg, Mississippi, 1849. A man walked into a library he was not supposed to be in. He memorized everything in it. He waited 22 years, and then one document at a time. He took back what had been taken. He was very patient. He was very precise, and he had an excellent memory.